Good morning. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being an attentive audience. And you have a husband and wife duo, married 31 years, students of the Middle East for about 35 years, just coming back from a trip to Qatar and trying to share our insights about the Gulf crisis, the things that aren't being reported in the news. So you have a specialist in Islamic studies and comparative religion, and a political scientist concerned with non-traditional sort of approaches to national security. So you put those together, and that's what we're here to deliver today. Okay? That's our title. We're trying to figure out how and why state power doesn't necessarily determine success in crisis situations. And
I guess you have to give this so she's going to talk about small states. I'm going to talk about insecure states, and then together we'll talk about the Gulf crisis. So we actually have like 6 slides or something, right?
Yeah, I have a poster.
Don't you just push the button?
No, I'm high-tech here.
All right. So this is how we're going to start with this epitome of the Gulf crisis. So this is actually taken from I guess it's the general law of the UAE. So if you express sympathy to Qatar through social media or any type of written, visual, or verbal form, you can be imprisoned for up to 15 years and 500,000 Emirati dirham, or both. So we think it epitomizes the crisis because it shows that states like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and their friends are worried enough about showing sympathy even by word or any other thing to Qatar that they would be imprisoned.
And I can just add to that, my area of specialization is looking at media and information politics. And so, as he said, so much can hinge on what you call something. And there is a lot of name calling going on in this Gulf crisis. It really kind of reminds you of the elementary school playground to a degree. And not because of like the fact that the outcomes or what's being fought over is minuscule. It's huge what's being fought over. Alliances, capital, energy resources, food resources, things that are critical to state survival. But the methods which are being used are sometimes seemingly like child's play. Like who's a terrorist, who's supporting terrorism, who's sympathetic to whom. And so we're trying to sort through like the serious struggle behind these games that are being played. And the other thing we're trying to figure out is that this crisis really allows you to sort of change your focus in terms of how power is defined. All right? I was reading some analysis, again, looking at the kind of game of words, and both Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates have accused Qatar of trying to foment insurrection domestically and threatening the survival, sort of an existential threat to Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. And I just, as a political scientist, I like to kind of sometimes have some numbers, and I wanted to look and see how these countries measure up in terms of just military firepower. And you can see the results, and you'll start scratching your head. How can a state that's 91 on the Global Firepower Index be an existential threat to number 24? Or even to number 60? And if you combine those ranks, and that means that the countries that form a sort of a half circle in terms of the border. Plus Egypt, number 10 in the world. So you're looking at a quartet. Bahrain, it didn't even make the rank. So anyway, outside of the Fifth Fleet, they don't really measure up. But the point is that there's something more here than military firepower. And I should tell you that this summer when we were in Lebanon, and also when we were in Jordan, there are these videos that are shown, these military, sort of militaristic videos of, here's what we're going to do to you, Qatar. And one of the ones that you found, Brannon, was, it said, the title of the video is A Message to Qatar. And do you want to talk a little bit?
So I mean, we should have brought it, but we couldn't find it. It's basically like they show all the UAE troops training, special forces and everything, and then they actually then cut to them on rubber boats, landing on a beach, and they're running up the the sand, and basically you're supposed to imagine that they're like on their way to Doha.
Yes. So there is definitely a military element, and I was thinking as we were boarding the plane to go to Doha, maybe this is the moment where they launch the beach attack, and we're going to get a first-hand pass to.
Them coming for hours.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because it's a crushed desert. Anyway, so we were like, will this conflict amp up to kinetic engagement? And if so, what is stopping UAE and Saudi Arabia from just basically wiping Qatar overnight? It would look like the conflict between Iraq and Kuwait in 1990, basically. Now, there are two keys on the board here, and that is the United States has 10,000 troops stationed in Doha, and we're number one in the world. And the other is that Turkey decided to send their own contingent, 5,000 or 10,000 troops, and they happen to be number 8. So if you combine Qatar, USA, and Turkey, then you have the answer to your question in terms of military firepower and why we're not seeing a repeat of 1990 Kuwait, Iraq. Did you want to add anything
No,
to
that's
that?
good.
Feel free to
Well, so
chip
you
in
should,
here.
so what, the way we're going to explain this is by talking about Qatar as a small state. Oh, sorry. Qatar as a small state, and then Saudi Arabia and UAE as insecure states, to try to kind of flip the normal way that people look at this, which is, oh, Saudi Arabia and UAE, they're really powerful states, and Qatar's a really small state, so how can there even be a competition between the two?
And ironically or not, we will end with some photographs that we took in December while we were in Qatar to show that the security of Qatar has actually increased as a result of the conflict, which was not what anybody would have predicted. So I like to say that Qatar is a small state with a big global footprint. And if you spend any time on the ground there, you will find that this is a matter of national security, to make sure that everybody knows about Qatar and that everybody thinks Qatar is like a great nation, right? So they spend a lot of time talking about how we're number one on the GDP index per capita. Now, some students were showing me some stats. They might have dropped to number 2. Okay, but yeah, big deal, right? But it was like Liberia or something, I don't know, or not Liberia. It was one of the small, yes, Liechtenstein, sorry. I obviously haven't had enough coffee anyway, somebody that you've never heard of before. But the basic point is that there are ways in which Qatar wants to be the winning team. Hosting the World Cup is another way that they have definitely put themselves on the map. Longest runway. As I was getting off the plane, or we were getting off the plane in November, they won another award, most entrepreneurial nation for sort of like business. And these are things that are just like, yep, we're doing it, They are higher on the Human Development Index than their neighbors, mostly because they have really promoted women's rights, women's health, access to education. So it's actually against the law in Qatar to have a baby not in a hospital with an OB team present. You can actually be fined and sent to prison for delivery. And it's because of the maternal mortality rates in places like Egypt, where they have access to health care, but people choose to have babies at home for cultural reasons. So they've taken care of that. They want to get their 5-star airline, sort of best airport in the Middle East. All of these things are sort of awards, sort of badges that Qatar is collecting to give itself a big global footprint. They buy hotels in the UK, they buy like streets in France, so investing their capital widely. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I mean, I think the key, what are those rectangles up there, is your first one, that our definition, a small state is one that cannot obtain security through its own capabilities. So the way that Qatar is doing that is by making friends and by making itself have this huge global footprint so that nobody can ignore them.
This is just picture it downtown.
Yeah.
I've never been there.
It's amazing.
Yeah. So.
And the other thing about the airline and the airport and everything is that the Qataris don't make money on all of those things. So they're not making money on their airline. They're not making money on, they're losing money But they're doing it because you could almost say that their airline is like their foreign policy, because it's allowing them to have this huge, larger global footprint of being the best.
And a shorthand to saying that is this is an investment in branding. Okay, we've been hearing that term tossed around a lot, but that's part of our question. How are these Gulf competitors branding themselves, and who's buying it, basically?
And what's that phrase we saw on the streets? It's Qatar deserves the best. In Arabic, it's like Qatar or something al-Afdal.
Yeah, well, Afdal, like the most preferred, the best, is the name of their public works organization, and everywhere around the city in fluorescent green are these signs that say Qatar deserves the best. So it's not just a matter of Qatar deserves to be known as the best, but Qataris and anybody who lives in that area also deserves to have the best.
Instead of saying like men at work, like caution, it'll say Qatar deserves the best.
Okay, and this is going to be where you take over.
Okay, so you can contribute to my thing. So my concept is this idea of an insecure state, and I also call it a bully state. And the reason I do that is because an insecure state is one that it has perceived domestic insecurity, so it's afraid for its own legitimacy domestically, and because of that, it acts out internationally. So like a bully who, doesn't feel good about himself and then picks on everybody else so that he can feel better about himself. That's how we're defining states like Saudi Arabia or UAE. So these are states that perceive themselves to be insecure domestically, that their regimes don't have legitimacy, and so they're lashing out, particularly at you could say their siblings, who they don't perceive as having that same illegitimacy. So one of the slides that we'll show you later is the idea that what the 13 demands are, that the Saudis and the UAEs, the Saudis and the Emiratis are opposed to Al Jazeera because it's providing an open platform for critiquing authoritarian governments, which is kind of the reason that Saudi Arabia feels insecure, right? So if an insecure state is one that feels domestically insecure, what is it that the Saudis in particular are trying to use to bolster their legitimacy? What's their claim? So the Saudi claim is based upon their role as leader of the Muslim community, right? Their legitimacy is based on their Islamic identity. So one of the things that we find ironic about the conflict is that the Saudis are using Islam as a weapon. So we have two examples of that, and then I'll let you talk about the other two. So the two so far is that during Ramadan, they impose a food blockade, which means that no one's allowed to eat during Ramadan, and the Qataris were talking about how children were starving, and they didn't have enough food to do the iftar, and this was a big deal because you can't celebrate after Ramadan. And the other one is what we're calling denial of Hajj access. So Qataris are not being allowed to go on pilgrimage to Mecca, and so it's becoming an issue of, well, that's what you're supposed to do as leader of the Muslim community, is allow everyone who wants to go on pilgrimage to Mecca. So in both those cases, the Saudis are using they're asserting their Islamic legitimacy as a weapon form against the Qataris. So I'll let you talk about the other two.
So in 2013, I had a Fulbright to the Gulf to study food security as national security. And it was a multi-country, so I started in Saudi, then I went to UAE, and then I ended up in Qatar. By the time I got to Qatar, the National Food Security Program was about to release their report to the Crown Prince, who was Sheikh Tamim. He became emir while I was there. So, and the fact that the National Food Security Program was advising the Crown Prince, they knew like on the day on which it was going to happen. So they would say, no, not this week, but probably next week. So I'm watching this whole process go down. But at the time, I couldn't understand why were they so interested in the information I had collected. I'm one woman, one foreigner, spending time on the ground in these two countries that neighbor them, that they have the same language and the same culture, and they're part of the kind of same extended family. But as you can see from the 2017 conflict, the idea that somebody had been studying the food security programs and vulnerabilities of their neighbors would be of extreme value to the Qataris. So they put me basically in the final editing stage and adding the kind of geostrategic element that hadn't been present because the consulting firm that they hired was really focusing on business development opportunities. That's how all these big advising firms are like, oh, you can make money if you do this, this, and this. And I'm saying, well, if you don't do this, this, and this, you won't have a country left, okay? So that was useful. Then what happened was they had these risk scenarios. In the risk scenarios, they were conceptualizing what happens if our land border is closed, or what happens if our sea access is closed, or what happens if our air access is closed. And in worst case scenario, what happens if 2 of those access points are closed at the same time? And when we thought about that, it was just like, oh my gosh, you know, Qataris are going to starve and it's going to be a crisis.
So they import what percentage of their food?
98%. Yeah, 98 to 99% of food and water is imported into Qatar, and 100% of water resources, fresh water resources, come from desalinization. So they have 0 access to fresh water resources. So any kind of threat to those 3 ports of entry are a matter of national security and state survival. So the fact that the 2017 blockade blocked all 3 of those access routes to food during Ramadan put the entire country in a panic. And did you want to say anything else, or you want me to talk about the end of that story?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So, as you can see in that photo, we had the first week of this, we had empty shelves everywhere. And part of that came from hoarding. Because you have a family of 12, you go and you buy whatever you can. So there was panic. The next thing that happened was that, and you should know that Qataris eat a lot of dairy, and Saudi Arabia with their Mara'i dairy was the main supplier. So you cut that off, but this is where Iran and Turkey come in. Iran and Turkey number 1, Iran number 2, are the largest dairy exporters in the Middle East. So it was within days that the dairy products were back on the shelf, coming from Iran. And one of the 13 principles was to get Qatar to distance itself from Iran. So ironically, by putting the blockade in, they drove the Qataris closer into the Iranian camp.
It's interesting to note, too, that is even before the Qataris had access, but they thought they were going to have access to the Iranian and the Turkish dairy, they had originally hoarded all of the Saudi stuff, and they then went and they threw it all away. Like as a protest against the Saudis, that we will no longer drink. And they said that, I think one of the quotes that we have in the paper is somebody saying, well, we don't really like the way the Turkish or the Iranian milk tastes, but we're not going to drink Saudi milk. Because there's something wrong with those people, yes.
And in terms of the information warfare, the Saudis and the Emiratis were tweeting the Qataris are going to be sick because they're going to be drinking Turkish and Iranian milk and they don't have the stomach for it. So there's kind of like battle going on in the information range and in the food range and also in the Islam range because it happens during Ramadan.
Well, let me add something about information warfare.
I just want to add one more dairy thing. So one more dairy thing. So Qatar decided overnight, oh my gosh, we've got to have our own dairy infrastructure. And because they have a ton of money, they basically retrofitted Qatar Airways planes to bring Holsteins from Ireland. And dairymen and women from Ireland. And within a couple weeks, they now have their own domestic dairy production system. And they can be self-sufficient if need be.
So an example of kind of summing up what we've talked about, so there's a scholar, a Muslim scholar who lives in Saudi Arabia. His name is Al-Auda. And he was arrested in 1994 and spent 5 years in prison because he had signed a document along with 99 other people. It's the best way to get arrested is put your name on a document, saying that the Saudis weren't religious enough, they weren't pious enough protectors of the Muslim community, and what we needed was a more responsible government, and we needed a constitution. So the Saudis arrested him. He was in prison for 5 years. He got out in 1999, and he was rearrested in September of 2017. And the reason he was arrested is because he had tweeted that he hoped that the Qataris and the Saudis would reconcile. He's still in prison. He's only been allowed one phone call, and it's almost been a year now. And his family doesn't even know where he is. So it's part of this whole information warfare, don't be nice to the other guys. But you can see that the threat to the Saudis domestically is by their own people saying you're not really being good custodians of Islam and of the Muslim community.
If I can just add as well, when we were in the Emirates in 2013, there was a trial for, the numbers vary, but 85, 94, whatever. It started as 94 being charged, and members of the ruling family of Ras Al Khaimah and a couple of the other smaller emirates, and they were basically charged with sedition. And then there was a separate charge that some of them were members of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is considered extremely treasonous. But part of the world was reporting that what they had really asked for was a constitutional monarchy with more limited role for the emir and a greater role for public opinion and participation. And this was considered the highest form of treason. They were charged with 15 years in prison, and many of them are serving their term. Interestingly, some of the women were sort of dismissed. They didn't have to. So sometimes it does pay to be a woman, you know. So, anyway, but that is both signs of domestic insecurity and concern about maybe a different kind of Arab Spring.
No, go ahead and switch to the next slide.
Next.
So this is the 13 demands. It's shrunk to what, 6?
Yeah, they changed it to 6. Started trying to be reasonable, yes. Right? But we think the 3 most important are number 1, 2, 3. So both.
In fact, all of the other, 10, are kind of versions of those 3.
Yeah. One of the other issues within the 6 is that Qatar should open itself to a visit, kind of like we do monitoring Iran's nuclear infrastructure. The Saudis and Emiratis want to be able to monitor Qatari infrastructure, whether information-wise, relations with Iran or Turkey, or they want to just have equal access to the kingdom to monitor to make sure they're making good. And of course, Qatar says that's a violation of our sovereignty and we're not going to sign that. So that's part of the reason there's a standoff is Qatar is saying this is our sovereignty and you don't tell us how to run our government, and the Saudis and the Emiratis are saying you signed certain deals about distancing yourself from Iran, about sending Qaradawi back to Egypt, and you're not making good on those.
So just to kind of emphasize the Iran part, so oftentimes we hear about disputes in the Gulf and it's between the Saudis and the Emiratis, and particularly Iran. And so one of the reasons they're upset with Qatar is they feel that Qatar's making good relations with Iran. And it's not just about dairy products, but it's also about economic, military, and religious things. So if we think about the idea of an insecure state and that being based upon their perceived claim that their legitimacy is not well-founded on them being a leader of the Muslim community, Iran is the major rival to that, right? Because Iran is arguing that, no, you're not, they're a loud voice saying, no, you're not a good representative of the Muslim community. You're not allowing free access to sites. The other thing to think about is the political part, right? So what type of government does Iran have? Iran has a democracy. Qatar has Al Jazeera that has free, people criticizing the government and talking about things. So these are the 2 weak points that the Saudis, the Emiratis and their friends seem to be worried about.
And if I can just add 2 elements to that Qatari-Iranian relationship. The de facto reason for good relations is that they share their major gas field. So it is, if you look at it, it's like a pie, and half the pie is in Qatari territory and half the pie is in Iranian territory. And both countries' national survival is tied directly to that oil and gas field, as you can imagine. A second thing, I was, as I said, advising the government in 2013 on their food security strategy, and I met with one of the members of the ruling family, and he said, one of our strategies long-term is to be a food hub. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, that's what the Emiratis want to do too, and they're kind of like maybe 40 years ahead of you with Jebel Ali and with their critical food storage at Fujairah port to be on the Indian Ocean and not be subject to the chokehold in Hormuz. And I said to him, the only way you would have any competitiveness as a food hub is if you were going to be a distributor for Iranian products. and it was, at the time, it was just sort of came out of my mouth, and he kind of gave me this look like, yeah, okay, fine, my cards are on the table, but it didn't really register. And then we have this 2017 thing, and the other thing they had at the time was a person of British descent who had some kind of intelligence background that I have no idea exactly what it was, but he was always going on missions to Iran to meet with agriculturalists. And so the idea was that the Qataris would invest in the Iranian agricultural infrastructure in exchange for direct exports back to Qatar of strategic foods like rice and meat and dairy products. So these things were going on in 2013, well before there was any kind of a sense of a crisis. At the same time, the Saudis and the Emiratis were making Sheikh Tamim sign secret agreements, which I believe were signed prior to the change of power domestically in Qatar. So I believe what happened was Tamim went, met with his neighbors, said, this is about what's going to happen. Can we have your support? And they said, yes, you'll have our support if you agree to this and this. And he said, fine. He signed the agreements. As soon as he was in power, he wasn't going to do what was being asked of him. So I think that the reason they were starting to look at Iran as a potential supply line was that they were anticipating that there could be a seal of the borders as a result of resistance to these secret agreements. And the New York Times and CNN had published these secret agreements with translations. I can give you links if you'd like, so you can kind of see the background from 2013 and 2015 to the relations. You want to go to the next page?
Yeah, so the reason we have Hannah Arendt up there is because in her book on power, she basically argues that, right? That you don't really have power if you have to coerce someone else. That power is really the ability to not have to use it. And once you use it, then you actually lose it, because then you look weak. And so we're arguing that by flipping the way we're looking at these states, that the Saudis and the Emiratis that look very strong because they're using their power, they haven't been able to force small, weak Qatar into doing what they want, so now they look weak and Qatar looks strong.
So,
yeah, you talked about that.
Is Iran's, there's three major dairy corporations. There are three major dairy corporations that make up Iran's dairy infrastructure, and Kala is one of the most sort of celebrated domestically. I learned by doing some research that they make cantaloupe-flavored milk, they make rose and saffron-flavored milk, date-flavored milk, honey-flavored milk, so all of these things that are to appeal to a Persian palate. But they also are supplying, this is at a little market in Doha, and yeah, I liked it because it was, to me, this kind of symbolizes why the blockade failed, all right? The other thing is Brannon was talking about insecure states, and we weren't sure what we were going to find on the ground in Doha, but one thing that we were instantly struck by is this kind of cult of the leader that hadn't been there in 2013. Maybe like near national buildings or something, or one flag flying or something. But you can't turn your gaze anywhere in the city now without seeing some cult of the leader celebration. And it always says Tamim al-Majd, the Glorious, which was created by a Qatari artist in response to the 2017 crisis. You can buy it on coffee mugs, T-shirts, stickers for your cars, yeah, flags. So we think that, and it's saying that the way the Qataris are saying is it's a historical reference for loyalty, love, and unity. And the other thing is that the expatriates have been brought into this. Like, we're all one team, which is very different than what it was in 2013, where it was like, thank you for being here to serve us, here's your salary, right? Yeah, regardless of where you were on the social hierarchy. But everybody is suffering, an increase in prices or decrease in availability or an inconvenience with travel. You can't now just pop to Dubai. You can't take a plane to Europe that goes through Dubai or Bahrain. So it's longer flights, more expensive costs. Did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's...
And then I think this is our last. Oh yeah. So here's another example of. Yeah. Can you read that, Brannon?
It just says like his.
Some I will.
His Highness, the leader. Like
Amir,
leadership.
yeah, Amir Tamim.
Amir Tamim.
And I like that it's done on a camouflage background, which gives a kind of military twist to it as well. And then you can see over here on this building, they've just hung this massive Tamim al-Masjid. Anyway, and then Sheikh Tamim is summarizing our entire talk by saying, this failed blockade shows how small states can use diplomacy and strategic economic planning to weather the storms of aggression from larger, ambitious neighbors. So I think you must have got a copy of our talk.
I don't. That's. I
Last
think.
words?
I don't have any last words. Let's.
Okay.
Whatever you guys want to ask us, you can ask us.
I do have a question. First, thank you. That was so fascinating. I learned so much. And it was great to see you guys around the crowd. Great images. Now, I'm not an expert in this field, but I'm interested in, I've seen a little bit in the past month of Saudi Arabian policy changing, especially toward women. And I was wondering if this crisis has any impact on that. If they're seeing, like, as you mentioned, that they're seeing, hey, we're not so strong anymore. Maybe I'm an optimistic person. Maybe they're seeing, like, hey, we need to change our policy, or am I just reading into this too much? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I know it's outside of
So
your
I
area.
just
You
applied
start
for
the
3
now.
grants to go to
Oh,
Riyadh
awesome.
to study why we're seeing all of these policy changes for women's rights.
Yes.
And what I found was a couple of articles that say that these changes, if you look at what's going on for women's rights in Iran versus what's going on in Saudi Arabia, that they both keep going into a one-upsmanship.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
fascinating.
So it's about competition and about the quest for hegemony, and the benefactor is women.
Yeah.
And the same thing is happening with labor rights. So workers have had some progress. I'm not going to say it's like a big rosy hug from any of the nations, but they've been able to make some progress. And it's because Qatar got rid of the sponsorship system, and then the Emiratis did, and then Qatar introduced a minimum wage, and then the Emiratis did, and of course the Kuwaitis did it 2 years before any of them, but quietly, because they're like the Norway of the Arabian Gulf. So it's very exciting. So we're going to actually be on the ground if everything goes as planned. June 15th, when women get to drive for the first time, and so I'm going to have a car. I'm just going to say, "Eat my dust" on the back, and I'm going to drive around the city and see what happens.
With a
Yeah.
camel in the back.
As long as there's no
Yes.
picture of Sheikh Tamim.
Okay, sir.
No. Yeah, so very,
Well,
very
that's
great
really
testing.
exciting. Look forward to hear all about it.
Yeah.
Well, and Saudi
Next
Arabia
year I'll
has,
come back.
Yeah, please.
Saudi Arabia has bigger fish to fry. I'll just mention 2 things.
Yeah.
So in 2015, the Henry Jackson Society released a report on the funding of extremism in the UK, and they blamed it on 2 things: people studying in Saudi Arabia, or Saudis giving money to support curricula where people went to school. So the Saudis are like, okay, we need to deal with that perception, at least of us. The other one is, an example would be the war in Yemen. So the war in Yemen is costing the Saudis $150 billion a year, over the budget they already have. So it's a hole in their budget each year. As well, it's become a humanitarian disaster. 17 million people on the verge of famine, 2.5 million people displaced, up to, depending on the estimates, 100,000 to 500,000 people dead, cholera, and then the Saudis keep getting blamed for bombing medical facilities and civilians, and the United States actually left because we couldn't trust that they wouldn't bomb us. So
Actually, they did.
So it's
Twice.
So it's
Our
and
troops.
the Saudis like to compete with, as Deborah said, with the Iranians. So if, let's say the war's been going for 2-3 years, so that's like almost $500 billion. The Iranians have invested about $200 million. They sent about a dozen troops. And so the Iranians are like, well, our investment's doing pretty good here. You know, we're costing you guys lots of money, a lot of stress.
Interesting.
Yes.
Can I ask you a few questions?
Sure.
One of them is, you didn't talk about the background, the history
Yes.
of all of these.
Where's the paper?
These
Yeah.
small countries.
Mm-hmm.
Aren't they all related historically?
Yes.
And
Genealogically as well.
yeah. And are there differences in the religious composition of these countries, or aren't they all Sunnis?
Yeah, all predominantly Sunni. Saudi Arabia has I think, 10%
Has the
Shia.
largest percentage of Shia population.
Yeah, but still,
Not
almost.
not counting Kuwait. Kuwait's
Yeah.
about 50-50.
And I think for me, that's one of the ironic things. Like, why would you keep Qataris from going on a Hajj if they're Sunnis and you've always allowed them to? It's clearly just a kind of like smack for not doing what we said, right? And I'm in the process now of trying to trace how far back the tensions go. And in terms of Bahrain-Qatari relations, there were arguments over some islands that go back all the way to, I don't know, like 1930s, and were eventually solved in the 20th century. So I think 1999.
Well, the British, yeah.
So there's that. In terms of Saudi, there's always been border skirmishes over grazing rights or over where the line between the two countries was drawn. But with that said, there are all kinds of Qataris who've married Saudis and vice versa. And the Qataris are arguing this is a human rights crisis because all of the Qataris married to Saudis were kicked out of Saudi Arabia and forced to go back to Qatar. And even the camels were expelled from the desert on the border, and many camels died, were trampled because there was like stampedes
And that's
going
more
on.
valuable than people's.
So students that were studying in Saudi Arabia that were Qatari were sent home, or in the Emirates were sent home. People who were working in investments and real estate, people in the Gulf, it's like the EU. If you're a Gulfie, there's no border, no boundary, no passport required. You can buy and invest, and so all kinds of integrated infrastructure. And so it seems that this crisis is notable because of the severity and the sort of the publicness of it, and the fact that people are dug in and nobody seems to be going anywhere. And you also have now 3 young kids, basically. A 33-year-old, he's probably 34 now, in Qatar. You have the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia, who's 33, 34. And Salman is basically, he has dementia. He can sign things, but he doesn't even know what he's signing. And that was the case in 2013. I mean, all the Saudis I talked to said, we have a succession crisis already because our head of state is not fulfilling his duties. It's whoever's in the Crown Prince position. And there's been a lot of going like this with that position. And then we have the Nahyan is also, the Emirati is young.
He's been
the
around
Crown
the
Prince.
longest in office, but he's still young.
Yeah, but the current emir in UAE is very ill, and so it's the Crown Prince who's sort of doing everything. That's the one building Ferrari World and Wild Wadi and I don't know what else they're doing, but yeah.
So we kind of have talked about it as like, I think we had it like sibling rivalries. So Qatar's like the younger brother who has everything, and the Saudis are the older brother who want to be respected, but and the UAE is kind of like the athletic younger brother, who's like really loves to do push-ups and pull-ups and all that, and they just kind of like they're on the playground fighting with each other.
Yeah. So the Gulfies would describe Qatar as nouveau riche and 1 foot out of the desert, 1 foot in the desert, 1 foot out of the
They
desert.
got both feet in it.
Exactly. Yeah. The Emiratis, if you go to Singapore, Abu Dhabi and Singapore look almost exactly alike, and there have been some architects that have done buildings in both locations. So they want to be the Singapore of the Gulf, and Saudi is like, look, I've got people, I've got territory, and I've got the Kaaba. So
Exactly.
get out of my, and I have the biggest military, and I also have, I've industrialized, and I've invested my wealth, and I haven't shared my sense that just because you're a Saudi, you deserve to have a $1 billion paycheck. I mean, the wealth in Saudi Arabia is very concentrated. You have people begging on the streets in Riyadh, which in nationals.
Saudi citizen.
And every other place we've lived in the Gulf, we are always embarrassed by our car because you have to rent a car and you like are getting a little Mitsubishi or not a Yugo. We had a Toyota. What was it? It was one step below a Corolla.
It was, I don't know. It was pretty
so,
small.
So we got this one step below a Corolla in Riyadh, and we're driving around, and we're looking around in rush hour, and it was like all of these guys in national dress. No women couldn't drive at the time. All these guys in national dress with a dirty car, driving the same car as us. And I thought, you know what? I got to take some notes here. I am going to count how many like cars I see during this whole time I'm in Riyadh, and it was 3: a Porsche Carrera, and a couple Mercedes. And then you land in Abu Dhabi, and they sell more McLaren in Abu Dhabi than they do anywhere else in the world. There was
Every
a
car
dealership,
is
a dealership on the way to my kid's school.
Ferrari, and
Yeah.
McLaren,
And the same in Qatar, fancy
Rolls
cars.
Royce.
So Saudi Arabia looks rich on paper, and in terms of branding, has branded themselves as the world's largest oil reserve. They're giving Morocco money to build a train in Morocco, and these Saudis that I was talking with, they're like, we don't have a train here. Why are we funding the Moroccans' train system? But it's all about branding. Big brother, here's a gift
Who
for
has
you.
the biggest building? Who has the longest runway? Who
Yeah.
has, what was the frozen fish market we went to in
Oh, yeah.
Abu Dhabi?
Yeah.
And there was I don't remember the number. Like, we have 27 stalls. It's like, why 27?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, well, because the Qataris or whoever it was had 26. So we had to have one more. Well, in fact, the Qataris had almost finished their airport, and then they had to start and redo the whole thing because UAE had put in a longer runway, and then they had to re-engineer it so their runway would be longer when they were finished.
But the benefit is whoever flies one of those airlines, right? They're always like trying to one up with your goodies you get.
Yeah.
What were you gonna say?
Well, the next question is, there have been several visits by very senior American officials
Yes.
to Qatar and to the neighbors
Yes.
to try to resolve this
Yep.
competition or conflict.
Yeah.
What are the Americans saying?
Officials who are no longer in those positions.
I was gonna say the person who's no longer in his job thought that we should be a mediator and just bring people to the table and then wait until they were ready.
This is Secretary of Defense.
Secretary of State, and he
Secretary
was
of
now
State.
so he's now out.
Yes.
So, and then the fact is, as soon as he's out, we get the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia coming.
And
There's
true,
like a
he's
sidebar
here
story
now,
about the president's son-in-law trying to get the Qataris to invest in one of their buildings that was about to go belly
And then
up.
there's an Iranian Jew who's been doing stuff for the Qataris and the Americans. You can read it in the New York Times.
It's
I
like
don't
a
know how much of it's
soap
true, but there's a small handful of people behind the scenes doing stuff.
Yeah, but we were out on Carrier Strike Group this last summer doing briefings for deploying troops, and I gave a brief in which I said that this situation is a perfect demonstration of the problem of the United States trying to make policy in the region, and that is we have weak alliances with weak states. So it doesn't matter if Saudi is a little stronger than Qatar. The fact is, when they're not playing well together, it's a real problem for us. And a demonstration of that, the admiral of the strike group said, I think I have an air base when I get there. But whether or not and where we'll be
Right, but
allowed
my
to fly.
base for my ship is in a country that doesn't talk to
Exactly.
the base where my airplanes have to land.
So Bahrain is going to be where they're porting, but the flying is going to be happening out of Doha. And that is a problem if your airspace is constrained by 27. And I don't know what happened. There must have been some here's all of the signals for our planes. We will be flying among your your zones. So.
Are you suggesting that this competition has a source in the local government, the national governments of these countries,
Yep.
and primarily in Saudi Arabia?
Yep.
And do you think that the new prince, who's effectively in power, is going to be able to do something either to suppress the bad apples or to create a popularly supportive message or government. They're talking about a constitution, or maybe they just adopted a constitution, didn't they?
Yes, he's talking about massive changes, and the reason is he can't afford to pay off the citizen demand for bread and circuses. And once you start getting a decline on that, you either get an opening of the political and social infrastructure, or you get revolution.
Yeah.
You can take your pick.
That's what they're afraid of.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So but I am telling you that this is a very dangerous road he's going down. Once you start giving people choices, and it doesn't matter if you're giving them a choice of which movie to see, they start to expect things. That if I can choose my movie, why can't I choose my leader? I've seen it happen. I saw it happen over a 15-year period of looking at internet use among individual citizen lives. And if I can choose where I get my news, why can't I choose my leader? And there's a kind of like, so.
There's no gradual way to implement effective change.
There's gradual ways, but you can't stop it. Okay, I gave you movie theaters, why do you want more? Right? That's, if your goal is to kind of like, it's like a pressure cooker, let some steam off by letting women drive and giving Saudis access to movie theaters, that's not gonna cut it.
But there are two, I think, good places to focus on. One is imprisoning the very senior leaders for corruption.
Yep.
And extracting what has been calculated as the corruption they benefited from.
Yeah.
Now, if you let me think again, I'll tell you what I thought the other issue was.
Yeah. I mean, the corruption thing was just a cash grab. He had to have enough money to be able to pay off the new things he's trying to do. And you realize it was a cash grab, and it was also a message to anybody who might try to confront his leadership.
Mhm.
But that was pretty.
There's an anthropologist named Larry Rosen, and he, for many, many years, he had one of those MacArthur Genius Grants. And he spent, the MacArthur Genius Grants, where they give you like all this money for, do
You
something
get
for
half
10
a
years.
mil to just kind of sit around.
And he went to
think about
Morocco,
books.
and he basically hung out in courts and talked to Moroccans about things, and he wrote this really interesting chapter on corruption, bakshish and wasta, and he comes to the conclusion that this is in Morocco, but I think it might apply in other places there, that corruption is not sharing your wealth with others. So in other words, if you're in power and you're not spreading the wealth,
Yeah.
you're not giving people kickbacks and stuff, then you're corrupt. In our country, it's kind of the opposite. It's like, well, wait a minute, you're not supposed to be. So I think when we hear about people being arrested for corruption, we have a different perception of what that is than what they do.
Another demonstration of that was the FIFA payoffs to get
Yeah,
the.
to get the
I
work.
have a friend who's an international lawyer, and I said, "God, you have to understand, this is a cultural clash here. The Qataris were doing what is customary and expected. You're supposed to lavish people with gifts and incentives. And you're saying that's against the law because they're trying to tilt the competitive wheel in their favor."
Like, what are you supposed to do?
I know, exactly. So it's a sign of international law not be culturally sensitive.
May I go on?
Yes,
If you
please,
stop me,
yeah.
if you have questions, please, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
you probably
But
came
this
for the
is-
next talk,
I
right?
did.
I'm interested in
Yeah.
what this means.
Yeah.
So the next question is, certainly the Americans, but I think broader than the Americans, are trying to persuade the Saudis to suppress Wahhabism and the
Mhm.
terrorism it supports.
Yeah.
What is your take on that?
You want to answer this? I have my own answers, but you want to answer what you think?
Well, I'll tell you a story first. So the story is when we were teaching 1 year in Kuwait, I somehow got into teaching a course on Islam. And it was just a men's class because they segregate the genders in Kuwait sometimes. And we were getting up to like the end of the class, up to the modern period. And somehow I said something and I used the term Wahhabi. And three young men in the front row immediately got nervous and they said, Sir, we're not called Wahhabis, we're Salafis.
Saudis.
And I said, well, that's interesting. So what does that mean? He said, well, we don't follow Ibn Abdul Wahhab because that would be wrong, that would be human. And we don't call ourselves Mohammedans, we don't follow Muhammad. we're Muslims, we follow God. And Mohammed was a really good example of following God, and Ibn Abdul Wahhab was a really good example. He said, but we consider ourselves to be Salafis. And I think the reason I tell you the story is because the Saudis have been branded by others as being Wahhabi. And I think the Saudis see that branding as the problem.
Is the problem?
Yeah, they want to change others' perceptions of what their religious outlook and what their how they view religion is.
So they would say, we're not Wahhabi, we're Muslim.
That doesn't address the question.
Well, the reason that it's an issue, one of the slides we had, that I think the Muslim Brotherhood is an issue, for example, is because the Muslim Brotherhood is basically saying, well, we're Muslim, and to be good Muslims, we have to be able to participate in our own government. We have to be able to criticize others. We have to have that freedom of expression. And the worst form of government is despotism or authoritarianism. So you have this group of people who have a kind of legitimacy as, you're good, you're Muslims, and they're saying, hey, you know what, you guys are not. And the reason that you're not is because you have a form of Islam that they call them hypocrites, that's hypocritical.
You have to permit me to say this, but when they get in power in Egypt, they do exactly what they say they're not supposed to do. So that's
Well, that's what
more
the
BS than
current
anything else I've
government,
heard
that's what
today.
the current government in Egypt would like you to believe. I mean, who was it,
I'm misinformed.
well, who gave $13 billion to finance the overthrow of the democratically elected government in Egypt? Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait.
And who was giving money to the Morsi government to bail him out? 20 billion.
Turkey, isn't it?
Kuwait, Qatar.
Cut it.
Mhm. So the thing is, this.
You've opened more issues that
Yeah.
explain some of these rivals.
Right.
Yes.
So.
Well, it's Saudi and friends, right?
Yeah.
As you-
Come on, you
Now
expect me to
Egypt and Jordan are part of the GCC. How did that happen?
Yeah.
That's
Monarchies.
interesting.
They can't vote, and they're not going to get a share of the oil wealth, but they're around the table.
If you're
To talk about.
in one of the GCC states, we all probably expect, well, you can't criticize the leader of your country, right? Like you can be imprisoned if you say something bad about the emir. Well, you also can be imprisoned if you say something about the King of Jordan or the King of Morocco, because these are monarchies. They're a certain type of government that is, as from their view, is somehow protected by their vision of their legitimacy as Muslims and leading the Muslim community.
I wanted to build on your Morsi question. So the problem with Morsi was that he tried to redefine his powers as president in order to undermine the influence of the SCAF, of the generals.
The deep state.
So the other thing he did was he started redefining rules for women. And that was a critical error because he pissed off the left and he pissed off the deep state.
Didn't
And
have
then
any
he was a
friends.
goner. So, but I think he had the backing of the majority of Egyptians for the changes that he was trying to implement, which means that he pissed off the United States as well. Because we want there to be democracy, but we don't want it to be like Morsi style. Yeah, so it created a big mess, and it meant we would.
Different administration at that time in the United States.
Yes,
That's true, too.
exactly. So, but it meant that we supported the coup. We didn't call it a coup because if it was a coup, we couldn't support it. Yeah, they had that war of words again. The other thing to build on your.
What was it that person called it at the National Council?
Oh,
It's like
yeah.
A non-mandatory governmental change or
Something.
Describing it, it was.
This was a very, very strong liberal Egyptian woman who was supporting the coup because she
But it
didn't
wasn't
like,
a coup.
we don't want like democracy with a long beard and a short dasha type thing, right? Not in Egypt, but I'm using that as a symbol. But the other thing to follow up on the Wahhabi question, from the inception of the state, the Saud tribe has had to satisfy the demands of the religious authority. And I think, I just got this idea while you were talking and you were asking questions, the degree to which that political authority starts to wane, the increase in the support for the
Terrible.
religious authority. So,
Goes up, yeah.
goes up.
Yeah.
Well, and even the
So-
opposition who's asking for what we would consider to be liberal change in Saudi Arabia is doing it using the language of religion. Right? The Saudi state is not pious enough, they're not protecting the Muslim community enough, we need a constitution.
So King Abdullah was very, very secure
Yes.
in his, I mean, he was 94, everybody loved him, and what did he do? He opened the Kaust University, where men and women study together in the same classroom, women can drive, and it's complete academic freedom.
World-class university.
Yeah, he opened, we were actually in Riyadh when this happened, he decided overnight that women should have 1/3 of the representative seats in the Shura Council.
Is it mine?
Sorry. That is me, I was like,
In the Shura Council, so overnight we have women entering into the democratic process. What else did he do? He did some other things that were pretty
Well, he opened,
revolutionary.
he financed a bunch of universities, he did the Saudiization, labor laws.
Yeah. He also completely stopped the production of wheat domestically, which was huge because that was a part of their food and national
Well, they were
security
using so
strategy
much
from the
water.
70s.
To grow it.
And he basically said, I'm sorry, we're not going to produce a single grain of wheat in Saudi Arabia by 2016. And so that made them 100% dependent on global imports, and they import only second to Egypt because of population size difference in terms of the amount. And they're basically now getting their wheat from the United States. That was the former U.S. ambassador in Saudi Arabia. He's a farm kid, right? He grew up on a farm, and he was very instrumental in getting King Abdullah to trust the United States with their grain supply.
All
Even
the,
though
all,
Carter-
the, all the potatoes, everything in Saudi Arabia, all come from the United States. They're all Idaho potatoes.
Yeah.
But
Anyway.
what about financing terrorism around the world?
Yeah. I mean, if you believe the Henry M. Jackson report or the documents recently released from the 9/11 Commission, there are Saudi ruling family member fingerprints all over it.
Well, it's not, if you read the stuff that's come out from September 11th, it's not just Saudis, it's Saudi government officials that were involved.
Yeah.
With the funding, so, but.
It's not just like, oh, there were some Saudi citizens who gave some money to somebody.
But the thing to remember is the Saudi family is 55,000 and growing.
That's a lot of people
That's like,
for a
you
family.
know, medium-sized city in the United States, right? So I think to try to sort of say like the Saudis are doing this, it's almost, it doesn't, I'm never sure when I hear that what it means. You know, which Saudi, positioned where, on whose behalf, for what reason? So the idea that there might be some ruling family members who are in tight with Islamists who the Islamists oppose the current, it's a proxy kind of move, right? So if we fund these guys, they'll support us when we try to get our claim to this ministry or that post or.
Well, remember, if the Qataris and the Emiratis and the Saudis are competing over buildings and runways, one other place they can compete is by funding different Islamist groups to overthrow Assad. Oh, let's fund the Islamic State, or let's fund Nusra, or let's fund these guys, and which one's being the best? And then, or Libya, they're doing the same thing, right? We'll fund these guys, you fund these guys. It's like, well, hey, we're going to do it better than you are. It's like, wait a minute, what are you trying to do?
The other thing is both the Qataris and the Emiratis have the same strategy. The more friends we have, the safer we are. The problem is Qatar's beating Emirates in terms of the spectrum of friendship.
Well, they have more money
Right.
than God, and they don't stop spending.
And they don't have any boundaries. If the Taliban want an office in Doha, fine. Although they do blame the United States for that office.
Well,
They say that-
we told them to bring them there so
When
we
we
could
were
talk to
trying
them.
to negotiate deals in Afghanistan, we told the Qataris to open a Taliban office so that we could meet in.
But we didn't know
neutral
they were going to
territory.
actually fly their flag over it like an embassy.
Right. And there was a grocery store we shopped at, and the Taliban loved that. And every time we went in
Well,
there,
the one
I felt
time
like they wanted to kill us.
he and I and the Taliban side each other, it's like, whoop, we went the other way.
They're easy to spot in Doha. They would never roll that.
This is not a question, but it's a comment in response to what you said. We have freed many prisoners from Guantanamo
Yeah.
and sent them to Qatar.
Yes.
Because they were, the government promised that they would be kind of isolated
Yeah.
and they disappeared,
Yeah.
right? They disappeared. But my real question for you is, and I know that's on your agenda,
Yeah.
what's the solution to this?
Yeah.
Too much is
I'm
happening.
thinking about my three sons who are always in competition with each other. I guess our three sons.
Our three sons.
How do you get three boys to not compete with each other? And the answer is the healthy competition is great because it drives each one to achieve more. So if women get rights and workers get rights and I don't know what else is going to happen next. You know, the airline get better and the flights are more efficient, then that's good competition. The unhealthy competition is when there's threats of war or you blockade an airspace so the United States can't maneuver. I mean, that's how we would say the competition is
Well, there
unhealthy.
may not be a war right now between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, but there's certainly a war in Syria that they're both participating in. There's certainly a war in Yemen, a war in Libya, and lots of people are dying.
So the basic point is, how can we encourage the healthy competition and get rid of the unhealthy competition?
Well, the answer with our kids, which might be true for them, is they need to grow up.
Well, you could say, you can threaten to move one or both of the bases.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that costs too
That
much
might-
money.
Well, and on that line, the Emiratis are incentivizing that. We only have 5,000 troops in the UAE.
Yeah,
And we have Jebel
Qatar's
Ali
much-
there, which is
Qatar's much better.
our R&R station for any Persian Gulf strike groups. So
it
there-
will take too long and cost too much money. It's not going to happen.
to change the
To
base.
move the base.
Well, and the other thing is Qatar's closer to Iran.
And the base in Qatar is in the middle of nowhere, which is exactly the way we want it.
So, anyway, yeah, bases are an interesting idea. So,
Well, it's like taking the money away from UNRWA
yeah,
and figuring out that matters.
yeah,
Yeah, you see all the Europeans replacing the money we took out, don't you?
exactly, yeah.
Well, and you
I
always
don't think
say,
they're doing anything.
if we're not in the Middle East, the Russians, the Chinese are waiting at the door.
That's the next
Well,
project we're
they're
working on.
there. They're there.
Yes,
They're even building a railroad, they say, from the Red Sea
Yep.
to Haifa in Israel,
Yeah.
of all
Yeah.
places. But Israel is not the solution to this problem.
Well, where did
Actually,
our
I don't
president
know.
go when our
the
president went to
Israelis
the
and the
Middle East?
Saudis are working like this.
yeah.
There have been Saudi generals in Jerusalem over the last 4 years, quietly.
The Saudis have already, we don't know for a fact, but we're pretty sure that when our president visited the two countries, that an agreement was reached. It just hasn't been reached. About the Saudis and the Israelis. They have common enemies and common friends.
Yeah. Although there was a high-ranking Israeli general at the Naval Academy, like the number one. Interestingly, Iraqi descent didn't speak a word of Arabic. So there you go. Talk about Israeli security. There you go. Anyway, he said we're looking at the wrong dog here. We don't need to be on the Saudi team. We need to be on the Iranian team. That's where our long-term interests lie. I went,
The Israelis saying that?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
And the reason is because Israel is a part of that non-team. And Israel has problems with Hamas, who is a part of the team they're currently in bed with. Right? At the end of the day, the Saudis have more in common with Hamas than they do with Hezbollah or Iran or the Israelis. Right? So if their short-term interests put them in bed with the Saudis.
Well, the Israeli general,
long-term
the Israeli
interest should
general
be-
asked, well, how many of these extremist groups are Shiites?
Mhm.
They're all Sunnis.
Well, Hezbollah, but if they were friends with
Hezbollah
Iran,
is a
then
local-
Hezbollah would go away as a threat.
No.
No, you don't think so?
Of course not.
Why?
It's religious. You're talking about strategic, but I'm
But
not
you
sure
know
you're
that the
talking about-
Shi'is in Yemen have nothing to do with the Shi'is in Iran. The Shi'is in Syria are considered heretics by the Shi'is in Iran. This whole idea that there's a Shi'i crescent, they're all different. They all hate each other, and theologically they all disagree. So that can't be the explanation.
So the basic point is Syria's in nobody's interests. It hurts everybody equally, basically. So how do we solve that? That's more important than how do we solve the funding of Wahhabi mosques. I
How
think.
many refugees do we have?
Yeah.
And the other thing is that this is a reason, that will surprise you. Just when you think this is what's true, then overnight something really strange happens. Like Saudi generals in Jerusalem.
I think the religious thing is overplayed, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
The Saudis and the Iranians were cooperating just a few decades ago.
Oh, they
Yeah,
still
and
have
so
visits
were the
back and
Israelis
forth.
The Israelis built Savak, the domestic
yeah.
intelligence service.
Well, so we have foreign midshipmen at the Naval Academy. They come for 4 years and then graduate.
Yeah.
So the very first foreign midshipman to graduate from Naval Academy in the 50s was in Iran.
Iran.
Yeah, we had our so-called Middle East Command was in Iran.
Yeah.
So we have long, long ties with Iran, and so did Israel, and it all changed in 1979. And now our business interests are in a different part of the Gulf.
And I'm telling you, the massive payload is developing Iran's infrastructure.
And that's where the
That's
Europeans and
where-
the Chinese and the
That's where
Russians
the
are.
real money comes. So if Trump is convinced that a nice tower in Tehran is the way to go, overnight it's going to just take one phone call and we're going to see the whole thing shift.
But not before he bombs them a few times.
I don't
We
know.
can't bomb
haven't bombed
Iran.
North Korea, and he's like flying on a plane to go meet soon.
We can't bomb Iran. There's over 120 sites that would have to be bombed. It's impossible. It's not like they'll go hit the plant in Natanz or whatever. We'll be good.
You don't think Bolton's
Can't.
ascendancy is going to...
Well, I don't want to talk about people,
In general, yeah.
specific people,
His
but
ideology is...
but militarily it is not an option.
But there's another weird conundrum. Ambassador to the United Nations and right winger. I don't like who is John Bolton? Right? Like what side of the bed will he wake up on tomorrow and what will he and Trump is similar, I think. It's very hard to kind of like pin a policy on him. So these are interesting times.
You don't see Bolton as some evolution of Kissinger?
That's interesting.
Bolton and Kissinger.
I was just talking about subtle diplomacy yesterday in class. So ironic that somebody who's like hardcore.
Doesn't Bolton have a law degree from Yale?
I don't know.
I think he has a
Yeah,
law degree.
and the
from
Secretary of Defense now has
Kissinger
a law
has a
degree from Harvard. So
PhD
there we get a
from
different
Harvard.
kind of competition. Whose degree is worth more? Let
Well,
me show
exactly.
you.
That's what it boils down to. They got Yale's and Harvards and
Yeah.
Princeton's fighting each other. It's like Qatar, UAE, and Saudi Arabia.
Anyway, thanks for your questions.
Yeah.
I mean, you should write a
You're the
book on
only
this stuff.
authoritative people who know something. You
No,
know?
I don't think that's
It's
true.
always been a challenge.
But it is important what she said. You have to go and be there as much as possible. You can't sit in the library. You can't read the newspaper. You have to go and see things.
And we have to go through, I won't tell you what we have
It
to
is
go
so
through to be
difficult
able
for
to
us to
travel to these regions, being
Because we work for
professors
the
at
government,
Naval.
so they
Yeah,
use
we're
all of
from
this
the
stuff.
But just yesterday, I had like an evaluation of my teaching, and the one thing that kept being said, evidently from the person who was doing it, is, "We love your stories. We love your stories." So I thought, okay, for the midshipmen, I will spend 25 to 35 hours for every hour I'm going to be on the ground in the Middle East in terms of paperwork.
Didn't
Anyway,
talk about Russia yet.
well, we could spend an entire day or two talking
One thing you
about
gotta know
that.
about the Russians, we're in Abu Dhabi.
Yeah.
Just I don't know if it's an epitome or what.
This is going to
They-
be a little bit culturally insensitive warning.
It's just a reality. They don't know how to use an elevator.
Oh, what?
So we would get into the elevator and there'd be Russians in there already. And they would ride with us until the elevator stopped on the floor they wanted to get off on. So they had no idea that you would just get in and press the button and get off. There's something like they don't have
We were
elevators in
living
Russia
in a
or what?
hotel. We were on the 21st floor, which was the top. So the Russians always wanted to come up to the top floor, and the fact was you didn't need a key to get in there. So they would always come up to the top floor to kind of see who's here, what's the view like, and then there was a hotel where you had like an interior that you could look down 21 floors, and so they would come up there and take selfies and stuff.
All I know is there's
But
more
so
Russians
we had to ride the
everywhere now.
elevator a lot with them.
Everywhere we go, there's Russians.
Yeah. So, but it's.
And that was not true 10 years ago.
What does that indicate?
It indicates that they're,
investment,
yeah.
interest, like direct flights to warm locations.
If you do Google Flights, you'll almost always pull up some Aeroflot flight.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just it's about the globalization of Russia, and just kind of a widening of their aperture about where in the world they deserve to be next, I would say. And sometimes I don't know, you're like, it's like Trump doing his sword dance. I love that. That is, to me, that is a completely brilliant metaphor of how somebody who is a genius, who has the strategic mind of a shark, and yet is put in an environment where he is culturally fish out of water and is just trying to do what it looks like he's supposed to do, and we look like complete idiots. Not because of him, but just because of where he is at that time. We have to learn how to sword dance if we're going to do
Look
it
at
right.
the stupid Americans trying to do sword dance.
Better than the guy next to us who's handed us the sword. We just need to
Well, I
practice.
believe that's obviously not his first visit or his first try to sword dance.
There must be someone in the State Department that trains you. You're going to have to do a sword dance. Okay, I'll give you
I
a
once
10-minute
had to
crash
dance
course.
at a Palestinian wedding with the entire village of women standing around watching me, and I didn't know I was going to need to do this. But they were like, it's like they'd been preparing for a week to host this American who was going to look like a complete imbecile when she's
They're
trying
probably
to
still
dance.
talking about it.
I know, and it was the most uncomfortable experience I've ever had in my life. And they were like doing the.
It's like a story where they tell you, they make the white guy eat the eyeball out of the. Nobody eats the eyeball. They just make the foreigner do it.
Anyway, so I had a moment of empathy for President Trump, who's having to do the sword dance. Anyway, I don't know where this is going, so we should
Well,
just
we're-
end it.
I think we're actually. I just found it so enjoyable. I'm sorry, we're like reading
Thank
it
you.
to everybody.
All right.
Thank you for being
We
here.
started a little late.
We
And
all have to cheer loudly so that it gets on the tape.
Hey!